Welcome. Thank you for joining our podcast today. Today we're going to conclude our troubling year of 1838, and we're going to venture through 1839 and hopefully find quieter, better times for the prophet Joseph. We'll be wrapping up our series of podcasts on the silver-lined clouds of war today. Let's begin with December the 1st, 1838, the prophet entered Liberty Jail. In 1833, Solomon Fry built this stone wall jail. It had two levels. It had an upper guard quarter and a lower dungeon. The walls measure 4 feet thick. Access to the lower dungeon was through a trap door, and there were 2 small grated windows for light in the dungeon below. It was a dark, dismal, filthy, wet, foul-smelling, vermin-infested hole. It was terrible. And these 6 men are going to call this place home for the next 128 days. There they would suffer physical trauma, toothache, earaches, pneumonia, hunger, and cold. The prisoners had many visitors. They had 90 visits from 67 different people. Wives, relatives, attorneys, apostles, and friends called on the brethren. Emma and Phoebe Rigdon were 2 of the first to visit. And when the prophet asked Emma for some blankets because it was so cold, she regrettably informed him that William McClellan had stolen them and she had none to give. Now, Sister Rigdon had come to nurse her husband's ailing health. While in prison, Sidney had what is referred to as a personality malady, probably due to the injuries he sustained when he was dragged from his home in Hiram, Ohio, and dragged by a horse on that cold, frozen ground. He had these uncontrollable fits of laughter and incoherent speech while he was in prison. So Phoebe and Sidney's daughter, Nancy, were a great comfort to him while he was in jail. Now, Mary Fielding Smith, Hiram's wife, did not greet her husband until February 1st, 2 months after he was incarcerated. And this is due to the birth of their son, Joseph F. Smith, at Far West on November 13th. Mary did bring the infant son to Hiram for a name and blessing. Joseph F. Smith would later become the 6th president of the church. But Mary became very ill after his birth on November 13th, so it took several months for her strength to return so she could come visit her husband in jail. The question might be asked, so why these 6 guys? Why were they jailed together? Now, jailing the first presidency of the church, Joseph Hiram and Sidney, is pretty obvious. But why Lyman White? And why Caleb Baldwin and Alexander McCrae? Lyman White was fearless in his defense of the saints at Adam-on-Diamond. He was the leader of the Diamond Boys, a feared group of men assembled to protect the Diamond community. He was a counselor also in the Diamond State Presidency and a colonel in the Caldwell County Militia. He also had some involvement with the Danite activities in the area, and so he was captured and charged with both treason and murder. Now, while in Liberty Jail, he was told that eventually he would replace David W. Patton as an apostle of the Lord. He was ordained to such an office on April 18, 1841, but eventually never really fulfilled that calling. Now, of all of those jailed at Liberty, Alexander McCrae suffered the most, both physically and emotionally. Alexander served as a captain in the Caldwell County Militia. Upon his surrender at Far West, Captain McCrae drew his sword, flaying it in the air, and drove it deep into the ground, and he stated, "You have got my arms, but you've not got my spunk." Well, it was his spunk and his unwavering faith that landed him in jail. McCrae and Caleb Baldwin would both serve, while in jail, the prophet as scribes for Joseph. Well, working with Joseph was a great comfort to Alexander because he missed his wife Eunice and he had 10 children. Caleb Baldwin, the man with the fiery tongue, always speaking in defense of his friends, he was the oldest of those that were jailed at Liberty. He was 47 at the time. Caleb was engaged in skirmishes with the mob while in Jackson County at what is referred to as the Battle of the Blue. He was captured and, as I quote, was beaten almost to death by Missourians with hickory sticks and the scars of which he carried for the rest of his life. Well, during the Mormon War, Caleb fought in defense of the people. He was arrested and charged with treason. He was brought before Judge Austin King to be arraigned, and Caleb asked for a fair trial and asked what was he to do with his family who were being driven from the state. And Judge King said, and I quote, "Renounce your religion and forsake Joseph Smith, and you will be set free and protected." Well, Caleb refused to do this, and as such was jailed with Joseph and the others. Well, as I mentioned, Caleb and Alexander McRae scribed for the prophet while in Liberty Jail. This included a 29-page letter to the saints that eventually would become Doctrine and Covenants, section 121, 122, and 123. On February the 7th, 1839, and again on March 1st, the brethren would try 2 unsuccessful attempts to escape, and we'll talk about those in just a few minutes. Eventually, however, they resigned themselves to be, quote, in hell surrounded with demons. On December 13, 1838, the Far West High Council met for the first time to try to decide what action to take. Brigham Young presided at the meeting. Far West was now a temporary refuge camp for more than 7,000 saints. The church had been fined $200,000 to pay the state of Missouri for the trouble of driving them from the state. The saints petitioned the legislature to rescind Boggs's order. A bill was actually introduced in the legislature to rescind, but was conveniently tabled until the spring, knowing that saints would be gone from Missouri by then. Brigham Young realized that the saints were running out of options. And if you read this slide, and with the death of David W. Patton and the apostasy of Thomas B. Marsh, you've got Brigham Young now becoming the senior apostle in charge. And again, his challenge is what to do. Where are we going to go? On December the 19th, Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball took care of some vacancies. They set apart John E. Page and John Taylor as members of the 12 Apostles, per Joseph's revelation on July the 8th. Well, as the year 1838 came to a close, Joseph celebrated his 33rd birthday behind bars. Quote, "Thus, in their gloomy prison house, in the land of liberty, in the town of Liberty, they beheld the eventful year of 1838 pass away. Its closing hours found them deprived of liberty, their families robbed and destitute, their brethren scattered and driven from their once pleasant, happy homes by a ruthless mob, and all of this for the testimony they bore of Jesus the Christ." On January 16, 1839, the High Council met for the last time at Far West. Brigham Young knew this chapter was coming to a close fast. Armed patrols were threatening the saints on every front, pressuring them to leave or suffer continued persecution. It was also felt that the prophet would not be released from jail until the saints had left the state. On January 29th, Brigham Young introduced a covenant to assist the poor, and he created a 7-member Committee on Removal. The covenant was signed by 380 men. William Huntington chaired the committee. The move was to begin immediately. But the question was where to go. West was Indian territory. South was back through Missouri. East, however, was familiar and reassuring. Quincy, Illinois was selected primarily because of the encouragement of Brigham Young's old friend, an old friend from New York, John P. Greene. Brother Greene had actually established a residency in Quincy in 1835 and was encouraging Brigham to consider moving the saints there. Now, historically, another group of people were being driven from their homes at the very time the saints were being ousted. The Cherokee Indians were being driven 1,200 miles to the west. Their trek became known as the Trail of Tears. Their march, like that of the saints, resulted in the deaths of more than 1,000. They crossed the Mississippi in January of 1839 near Cape Girardeau, at the very time the saints were forced to cross the Mississippi River near Quincy, Illinois. Well, the trial at Liberty began on January 25, 1839. It would last 8 days. Perhaps the most significant outcome of the trial was the release, of all things, of Sidney Rigdon. You see, Sidney pleaded his own case and was so convincing and eloquent that he had everyone in tears. In fact, the court released him and even passed a hat to raise a little bit of money for his return. After collecting about $100, he was told, quote, "Now, old gentleman, make the quickest possible time to your family who need you and your help." Well, 1 month later, on February 25th, he was given a horse, a pistol, a guide, and told to flee the state of Missouri. Meanwhile, Brigham Young and the Committee on Removal were busy preparing the way for the migration to Quincy. The strategy was to place corn and food along the trail to assist the poor and needy. The committee decided to move the families of the prisoners first. On February the 6th, 1839, committee member Stephen Markham left Far West with Emma Smith. Emma walked the 150 miles. She crossed the Mississippi River on February 15th with Alexander and Frederick in her arms and Joseph III and Julia at her skirts. Emma was unaware of Joseph's condition, and so she secured the sacred manuscript of the inspired translation of the Bible and found shelter in the home of a gracious Quincy family, John and Sarah Cleveland. Judge Cleveland's generosity was also later extended to the Rigdon family. Well, during February, 10,000 saints migrated to western Illinois. The Quincy Democrat Association made several resolutions promising assistance to help the forthcoming saints. It was at this time that Brigham Young fled Far West as threats to his life increased. Okay, a little bit about the Clevelands. Sarah and son Augusta joined the church in 1835. John and son Alexander did not join. The Clevelands moved to Quincy, Illinois in 1836, and later they're going to move to Nauvoo in 1842. Sarah would serve as first counselor to Emma Smith in the first Relief Society presidency. She also became a plural wife of Joseph Smith. John became a judge in Nauvoo, and although Sarah wanted to go west with the saints, she was advised by Brigham Young to stay with her husband, for he was a good man. She stayed with John, and she died in 1856. Well, as I mentioned earlier, there were 2 jailbreaks that were attempted by the prisoners while in Liberty Jail. The first occurred on February 7th. The prisoners were assisted by 6 other brethren, and an attempt was made to overpower the guards bringing food. Well, they were unsuccessful in this effort, and many of their accomplices were then jailed and arrested. Well, the second occurred on March 1st. Orem Porter Rockwell had smuggled an auger into the cell. The attempt was going to be made to loosen the stones and logs and try and dig our way out. But their escape plans were leaked out, and 10 guards stopped them before they started. Meanwhile, 250 miles away, the saints were pouring into Quincy. It was evident a more permanent settlement needed to be found. The saints had settled as far away as 75 miles from Quincy in small groups. 2 of these groups were settled in Lima and Yellowrome. They were headed by Isaac Morley. With the encouragement of Joseph, a committee was formed to search out a new gathering place. Newell Knight and Alanson Ripley were the 2 to take the lead in this effort. Now, with regards to Lima and Yellowrome, these settlements, by Isaac Morley, a sizable stake of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, with Isaac Morley as president, was established in Lima, Illinois in October of 1840. The saints in both settlements together formed the Lima branch or stake of the church. The settlement of Yellowrome was eventually burned to the ground by a mob in September of 1845, forcing the residents to flee to Nauvoo, Illinois. Interesting, Yellowrome is Morley spelled backwards. Now, a conference A conference of the church was held in Quincy on March 17th, and the likes of Hinkle, Avard, Phelps, Marsh, and others were excommunicated, and George A. Smith was appointed to the 12 to replace Thomas Marsh. On March 15, 1839, Hiram Smith submitted a petition of habeas corpus from the imprisoned saints there in Liberty Jail. It was endorsed by others and then addressed to the Missouri Supreme Court Justice George Tompkin. A writ of habeas corpus really means produce the body. It is a court order demanding that a public official deliver an imprisoned individual to the court and show a valid reason for that person's detention. The brethren were starting to pressure the state to either charge them or release them. Meanwhile, Brigham Young and the Committee on Removal were busy preparing the way for the migration to Quincy. The strategy was to place corn and food along the trail to assist the poor and needy. The committee decided to move the families of the prisoners first. On February the 6th, 1839, committee member Stephen Markham left Far West with Emma Smith. Emma walked the 150 miles. She crossed the Mississippi River on February 15th with Alexander and Frederick in her arms and Joseph III and Julia at her skirts. Emma was unaware of Joseph's condition, and so she secured the sacred manuscript of the inspired translation of the Bible and found shelter in the home of a gracious Quincy family, John and Sarah Cleveland. Judge Cleveland's generosity was also later extended to the Rigdon family. Well, during February, 10,000 saints migrated to western Illinois. The Quincy Democrat Association made several resolutions promising assistance to help the forthcoming saints. It was at this time that Brigham Young fled Far West as threats to his life increased. Okay, a little bit about the Clevelands. Sarah and son Augusta joined the church in 1835. John and son Alexander did not join. The Clevelands moved to Quincy, Illinois in 1836, and later they're going to move to Nauvoo in 1842. Sarah would serve as first counselor to Emma Smith in the First Relief Society presidency. She also became a plural wife of Joseph Smith. John became a judge in Nauvoo, and although Sarah wanted to go west with the saints, she was advised by Brigham Young to stay with her husband, for he was a good man. She stayed with John, and she died in 1856. Well, as I mentioned earlier, there were 2 jailbreaks that were attempted by the prisoners while in Liberty Jail. The first occurred on February 7th. The prisoners were assisted by 6 other brethren, and an attempt was made to overpower the guards bringing food. Well, they were unsuccessful in this effort, and many of their accomplices were then jailed and arrested. Well, the second occurred on March 1st. Orem Porter Rockwell had smuggled an auger into the cell. The attempt was going to be made to loosen the stones. And on March 20th, while in Liberty Jail, Alexander McCrae recorded an enlightening revelation given to Joseph. O God, where art thee? My son, peace be unto thy soul. Thine adversity and thine affliction shall be but a small moment. And then, if thou endure it well, God shall exalt thee on high. Thou shalt triumph over all thy foes. Thy friends do stand by thee, and they shall hail thee with warm hearts and friendly hands. Thou art not yet as Job. Thy friends do not contend against thee, neither charge thee with transgressions as they did Job. Thou art called to pass through tribulations. And if the very jaws of hell shall gap open its mouth wide after thee, know thou, my son, that these things shall give thee experience, and shall be for thy good. The Son of Man hath descended below them all. Art thou greater than he? Well, this enlightening revelation was a source of great comfort to the brethren while in jail. Well, with the refugees outnumbering the Quincy residents 3-1, many residents became pretty interested in the Mormon ways and their teachings. Washington Park became a tent city and a favorite place to preach from. One such resident, Ezra T. Benson listened with great interest as the brethren testified of Jesus Christ. Later, his grandson, Ezra Taft Benson, would serve as president of the church. Well, as Brother Knight and Ripley were searching for a new gathering place, Mr. Isaac Gayland and Hugh White, they were local friends of the church, offered to sell the church land in the town of Commerce, Illinois. Commerce lay about 50 miles north of Quincy. The land was pretty swampy, damp, and unhealthy, but the price was right. However, for the time being, they determined to wait. They wanted to look and see if there were land elsewhere. Well, as the saints were looking for a new place of residency, Joseph and his brethren found themselves finally moving on. They were leaving Liberty Jail on April 6th, 1839, on basically the 9th anniversary of the church. After 128 days of confinement, the prisoners were taken to Gallatin, Daviess County. There they were going to be set before a hearing of the grand jury. On Monday, April 8th, they were put into the custody of Daviess County Sheriff William Morgan. They were taken a mile out of town to the home of Elijah B. Creekmore, where this trial was to take place. Well, during the interim, Joseph was confronted by John Brassfield. He was the premier wrestler in the state, and he wondered if Joseph would wrestle him. Well, Joseph consented and promptly threw him twice, the second time into a mud puddle. Well, Mr. Brassfield grew to respect Joseph for his strength and his conviction. On Tuesday, April 9th, the hearing convened with Judge Thomas C. Birch. Now, Birch was the prosecuting attorney at Richmond, and apparently now the judge in this particular trial. And by April 11th, the jury, a majority of whom were drunk most of the time, and 3 of whom were involved in the Hans Mill massacre, they convicted the brethren of treason. Well, the defense counsel objected and requested a change of venue on grounds of extreme prejudice. Well, the request was granted, and the order was given to change to Boone County, the same location where Parley P. Pratt and his group were being held. So Sheriff Morgan, William Bowman, John Brassfield the wrestler, John Pope, and Wilson McKinney escorted the prisoners out of Gallatin and headed towards Columbia in Boone County. They traveled first to Diamond, where they spent the night at William Bowman's cabin, formerly that of Lyman White. They then traveled on for 3 days. On Tuesday, April 16th, they stopped at Yellow Creek in Chariton County. Governor Boggs had instructed Judge Birch to provide an opportunity for the prisoners to escape. The state had been embarrassed enough. The illegality of what had occurred over the last few months needed closure. Sheriff Morgan had been instructed, quote, never to carry them to Boone County. Well, that night, 3 of the guards got drunk, and the other 2 assisted the group's escape. And just prior to leaving, the prophet gave a promissory note for full payment for 2 horses, plus an amount agreed upon for their freedom. The total was $500. The note would be paid in part to Heber C. Kimball a few days later, and again on February 23, 1843, when John Brassfield visited Nauvoo and received the balance owed him. Now, when the guards returned home to Gallatin, they claimed that they had been overpowered by the prisoners and they had escaped. Well, the residents beat and tormented these people for allowing them to escape. In fact, William Bowman was singled out and tied to a steel rail and dragged around through the streets. He actually died a short time later. On April 18th, with Brigham Young having fled the area, Heber C. Kimball ordered the Committee on Removal to leave Far West immediately, for their lives were in danger. The men gathered the things together and left within the hour. That very day, 12 men came into town with intentions of killing the brethren. Far West was now completely deserted. On that very same day, Brigham Young, Orson Pratt, Willard Woodruff, John Taylor, George A. Smith, and John Page left Quincy en route, where? to go back to far west to fulfill the prophecy Joseph had given on July 8, 1838, that on the very temple site at far west on April 16, 1839, the apostles would then leave for missions to England. Unknowingly, like ships in the night, Joseph and his brethren who escaped, nearing Quincy, passed the apostles heading to far west. Again, like ships in the night. Well, as the apostle Heber C. Kimball secreted himself, waiting for the apostles to arrive at far west, he learned of Joseph's escape. He actually met Mr. John Brassfield, returning to Gallatin, who presented Heber with a note drawn by Joseph for that $500 for the 2 horses. Heber raised $400 and gave it to him. Elder Campbell then secreted himself and awaited, in this extremely hostile area, the arrival of his apostolic friends. On April 26th, Heber joined his faithful friends, and they quietly slipped into far west. They convened a conference at the home of Samuel Clark. 31 individuals were cut off from the church. At midnight, the group assembled at the temple site. Wilford Woodruff and George A. Smith were ordained as apostles. All 7 of the 12 offered prayers on the southeast cornerstone and sang the song, Adam on Diamond. Well, under the direction of master builder Alpheus Cutler, a 1-ton stone was rolled by the brethren onto the southeast corner, laying the foundation for the temple agreeable to Revelation. With John Page, John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff, and George A. Smith now ordained, the covenant was now fulfilled. The apostles then left for Quincy to prepare to serve their missions, thus fulfilling the revelation given Joseph on July 8, 1838. Well, as Joseph's group traveled close to Quincy, they used fake names with those that they would meet en route. On one occasion, Alexander McCrae, who was traveling under the name of Mr. Brown, he forgot his name when confronted by a passerby. He suddenly faked getting sick until one of the other brethren approached and asked, "Mr. Brown, what is the matter?" Well, he immediately felt better once he was reminded of his fictitious name. However, the nice man insisted that he drink a glass of whiskey to ensure his continued health. Well, knowing who he might meet again, the prophet went through, from the time he was released, he went through Macon and Shelby and Marion counties en route to Quincy. Now, on April 29th, Joseph entered Quincy. The first person to meet him was Demick Huntington, and he told Joseph that his family was 4 miles just west of town at the home of John Cleveland. And what a glorious reunion must have occurred as Joseph was reunited with his family and good friend Sidney Rigdon. With Joseph now reunited with the saints, he immediately set out to establish a new home for the faithful flock. He visited the Commerce, Illinois area, which consisted of 1 stone house, 3 wooden homes, and 2 block houses. Well, despite the unhealthy location, Joseph felt that this was the right place. And on April 24th, the council resolved to purchase Commerce and also visit Iowa across the Mississippi for additional land to settle. It's interesting, the history of Commerce. From the Indian name Ketchakuma to Trading Oaks, that would be in 1823, to Venus in 29, then finally to Commerce in 34, and then finally to Nauvoo in 1839. The land was purchased on May Day, 1839. The church purchased 135 acres of swampland from Hugh White for $5,000 and 47 adjoining acres of improved land from Dr. Isaac Gayland for $9,000. Later, other purchases would be made on the Iowa side of the Mississippi River. On May the 2nd, our 7 faithful apostles returned to far west. And on May 4th, a conference of the church was held there in Commerce, sanctioning the proceedings of the 12 in the absence of Joseph. Brigham Young was set apart as president of the Quorum of 12. The 12 were to begin their missions as soon as possible. Eventually, 9 of the 12 would perform their missions. Now there in the Nauvoo Cemetery you see these stones. In 1824, Captain James White, the original James White, purchased the land of Venus. That's what it was known prior to commerce. He traded with the Saxon Fox Indians to acquire the land. He built the first stone house near the Mississippi River edge where his son, Hugh White, would live. And then Hugh White eventually sold 135 acres of swampland to the church in 1839, and the prophet and his family moved into Hugh White's home, that stone home near the river's edge. Well, the saints were also told to prepare to move to Commerce, Illinois. And on May 10th, the prophet Emma and their 4 children moved into their 2-story log house, which formerly belonged to Hugh White. By mid-May, the prophet was laying out a city. Swamps were being drained, trees being cut, and land being plowed. And for the 5th time in less than 10 years, the saints started over. Joseph renamed the city Nauvoo, a Hebrew word, which translates literally to a beautiful station, or the city beautiful. Now, meanwhile, in May of 1839, Parley P. Pratt found himself with Morris Phelps, King Follop, and a guy named Lyman Gibbs, who was kind of a Mormon turncoat. They were all in prison in Columbia, Boone County. That's where Joseph was headed before he escaped. Earlier in April, Judge Austin King had released brothers Chase and Shearer. The change of venue from Richmond to Columbia was based on, again, extreme prejudice in Richmond, as you can imagine. These brethren would record more than 7 months behind bars. Eventually, on July the 4th, 1839, amidst the holiday commotion, Parley, Morris, and King escaped. King Follett, however, was quickly recaptured. However, with the assistance of Parley's brother, Orson Pratt, Parley and Morris did escape to Quincy, much to the joy of their families and friends. King Follett was finally acquitted of everything and released in October of 1839. However, the turncoat Lyman Gibbs, he stayed in prison for a while after that. Well, as Nauvoo started its history, Joseph started writing his own. On June 11th, with the aid of his clerk, James Mulholland, the sacred record was begun. Many scribes were used. Some fell away and never returned. Some fell away and returned, and others died. This is an ongoing challenge for Joseph to find the right aid and clerk. On June 24th, the city of Nashville, Iowa, just across the Mississippi River, was purchased. It consists of 20,000 acres and became an alternative settlement for the saints. And here we have a list of some of the scribes of Joseph: Martin Harris, Cowdery, John Whitmer, Rigdon, Frederick G. Williams, Warren Parrish. There's James Mulholland, W. Phelps, George Anderson, Willard Richards, Thomas Bullock, William Clayton, and Robert Thompson. All of these individuals, at one time or another, scribed for the prophet. And let us not forget our 2 friends in jail, Alexander McCrae and Caleb Baldwin also scribed for him. On June 27th, 1839, the first conference of the church held in Nauvoo commenced. At this conference, Orson Hyde, who had given testimony against Joseph at Far West, he confessed of his wrongdoings, and then later in October, Orson Hyde would be restored to the quorum of 12 apostles. It's kind of interesting. Ironically, on this date, a great day of rejoicing with the return of the prodigal son, 5 years later on that very date would become the saddest day in the history of the church, as the prophet was martyred. As early as 1832, when he was a newly baptized member of the church, eager to know the will of the Lord, Hyde sought direction from Joseph Smith, whom he considered to be a prophet. In a blessing Hyde received in 1832 at the hands of Joseph, Hyde was told, quote, "Thou shalt go to Jerusalem, and be a watchman unto the house of Israel, and by thy hands shall the Most High do a good work, which shall prepare the way and greatly facilitate the gathering together of that people." We'll be talking a little bit about this later in this incredible mission that Orson Hyde took. Well, as we bring the silver-lined clouds of war to a conclusion, I feel perhaps the need to bring to closure a few other loose ends. The 80 acres which contained the temple site at Far West was purchased by President Joseph F. Smith in 1909 from Jacob Whitmer for $7,000. The title now resides with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It took 137 years before the truth of the persecutions against the Mormons was acknowledged by the state of Missouri. On June 25, 1976, Governor Christopher S. Bond executed Executive Order 197-60625, rescinding Boggs' Executive Order 44. He labeled the incident as a dark chapter in Missouri history. Part of that rescinding order reads, "Now therefore I, Christopher S. Bond, Governor of the State of Missouri, by virtue of the authority vested in me by the Constitution and the laws of the State of Missouri, do hereby order as follows, expressing on behalf of all Missourians our deep regret for the injustice and undue suffering which was caused by the 1838 order. I hereby rescind Executive Order Number 44, dated October 27, 1838, issued by Governor Lilburn Boggs." Let's talk just a second about the Whitmers. After the Saints fled Missouri, the Whitmer family, for the most part, stayed put. Peter Whitmer III died in Richmond in 1854. Jacob Whitmer, a Book of Mormon witness, died in Richmond in 1856. David Whitmer, one of the three witnesses, died in Richmond in 1888 after starting up his own church, the Church of Christ. John Whitmer, the first church historian, he died in Kingston, which is very close to Richmond, Kingston, Missouri, in 1878. Hiram Page, a Book of Mormon witness and a relative of the Whitmer family, died in Richmond in 1852. Now, Oliver Cowdery's death on March the 3rd, 1850, was among friends also in Richmond. He was rebaptized on November 12, 1848, by Orson Hyde at Potawatomi, Iowa. He was en route to Utah after a 10-year absence from the church. He stopped at Richmond to see his old friend David Whitmer. Remember, Oliver Cowdery had married a Whitmer daughter. He became ill during his visit and died in Richmond. Oliver and the Whitmer men never denied their conviction of the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon. And I found this interesting. This is Oliver Cowdery. It's kind of a deathbed declaration to a newspaper man named Jacob Gates. Oliver said, "I want you to remember what I say to you. I am a dying man, and what would it profit me to tell you a lie? I know," said he, "that this Book of Mormon was translated by the gift and power of God. My eyes saw, my ears heard, and my understanding was touched. And I know that what I testify is true. It was no dream, no vain imagination of the mind. It was real." Well, what silver-lined clouds can possibly be found in persecution, bondage, and war? Could any just and noble man have benefited from 5 months of 24-hour-a-day confinement? Well, perhaps only one, the Lord's anointed prophet, Joseph Smith. Only with his body captured could he truly liberate his mind. Hiram Smith said, quote, "There were prophets before, but Joseph had the spirit and power of all prophets." Well, before Liberty Jail, the mantle of spokesman for the church fell on Oliver Cowdery or Sidney Rigdon. But after Liberty, no one ever spoke for Joseph again. The last 5 years of his life would be filled with the knowledge of the magnificent plan of salvation in all of its glorious fulfillment. Parley P. Pratt once said of Joseph, he could gaze into eternity, penetrate the heavens, and comprehend all worlds. Joseph was able to find the silver-lined clouds of war. Now, as promised, now that we've concluded this particular portion, I'm going to go back to the subject of Adam on Diamond, as I mentioned I would in a prior podcast. We'll take an opportunity to discuss Diamond's past, its past history, and its future relevance. I think you will really enjoy this next podcast. Until then, enjoy Come Follow Me, and above all else, keep your scriptures close.